artificial interest rates, I think, are also incredibly damaging. And so there's a few ways, right? One is, I give an example of a factory in the article, right? Like, let's say the natural interest rate in a market is 6%. And then a government comes along and says, like, lending money, making interest is evil. The maximum, which has happened in England, in the past, right? There have been these kind of pushbacks against, earning interest off lending money. And so they say the maximum you can lend for is 2%, right? And so let's say there's a bunch of entrepreneurs, there's a bunch of potential business owners that say, great, I can borrow for 2%. That's wonderful. And so they 100 of them borrow money and they go try to build factories because, borrowing at 2% is better than borrowing at 6%.
Sorry, can we just walk back that second? That isn't a rate that's set that you can only lend out. That's the base rate at which the banks borrow.
In the past, they actually had, you have to lend at this rate.
But that's not true now.
No,
that's the base rate at which you can borrow money from the government or the banks can borrow. So that's the base rate. That's the base rate. So that's slightly different.
Yes.
How does artificially setting the base rate distort the market?
Well, so it's the same thing. It brings it down, right? Like if you set the base rate to 1% and then the banks lend at 2%, it's the same thing as forcing everyone to lend at 2%. It's all about that end number, right?
Yes, but I can still set my own rate above it. Is the issue really the base rate? So I'm just trying to work this through in my head, or is it that the government is trying to flood the market with capital, allowing it to be lent at that lower rate?
I think they're interrelated.
Buying out so for example, I'm just working through it in my head. Mortgage company, banks have lent money out to people with mortgages. People cannot afford to buy their mortgages. The government ends up buying those mortgage securities and then giving money to the banks to re-lend at that low interest rates. That to me feels like where the distortion is happening.
It's a subsidized. I mean, to have an artificially low rate, you have to kind of subsidize that, right? That's possible with the central bank. No central bank, it costs money to do that, right? You have to actually make those loans.
Yeah, Danny, work this through with me, but essentially by buying those government securities, those bank securities, they're subsidizing that bank's misallocation of capital to people who can't afford to buy those mortgages.
Yes.
And if the interest rate set at say 1% and you're a bank offering 6%, just no one will go to you.
Exactly.
They'll go to someone else.
Yeah.
Who's offering it at 5%, and then someone will offer it at 4%. So it's just the competition within the market.
It's a race to the bottom,
but
right?
If there was no base rate, that competition might still exist. It's not.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. It's not the government setting the rate.
Yeah.
It is the it's the way they've been subsidized. I don't think it's the base rate that government, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's the government base rate which is the issue. I think it's the subsidizing of the banks that is the issue, that allows them to have ever increasing amounts of capital to lend at low rates.
So I just think those things interact with each other, right? They're not completely separate.
Yeah.
And you do have this race to the bottom that if, the federal funds rate is 0%, then it is profitable for a bank to lend at slightly above that, right?
Yeah.
And then there's also the bailouts. There's also the subsidization. It takes the risk away from them for bad loans. They're not super they still have some consequences from bad loans, and I'm not like a deep bank plumbing expert. So if I say something wrong here, excuse me, but they still have some responsibility for like a non-performing loan, but they have been bailed out. There have been, essentially subsidizations there. I mean, there's a diffusal of responsibility that is really widespread throughout fiat, where large financial institutions are not truly responsible for their own decisions because there is this ability to create money. So it plays a key role, and they interact. But I think what you really want to focus on is not how or not like how it happens or what might happen, but what does happen.
Yeah, what does happen?
What does happen? What does happen is when that rate is really low, banks lend really low. And it kind of is irrelevant if it could be different or why in some ways. But what does happen is when the Fed has rates at 0%, I get a 2.5% mortgage, right? And when that rate goes up, now mortgages are 7% and treasuries are higher, right? That's what does happen.
So what is the issue with low rates? Talk
Yeah.
to me about your car analogy.
Yeah, so that's on negative. The car is on negative rates. The issue with low rates is in the factory. So let's say we have a world, we artificially bring low interest rates down to say 2%, and the natural market of like where the market would naturally set those would be 6%. So all the entrepreneurs, they look at this 2% rate and they say, wonderful. Capital, money's available, I can borrow cheaply, the numbers make sense for me to make this long-term investment into my factory. And so 100 entrepreneurs, they borrow at that 2% rate, and they go to build 100 factories or buildings. Factories or buildings. And what happens, and we've seen this in history, is they run into a shortage of physical goods, right? There's not enough bricks, there's not enough wiring, there's not enough of the actual stuff, because the low rate has simulated a world in which those resources were abundant, they were available. It distorted reality. But when they actually go to build the factory, those resources are not available, they're not abundant. And so we saw this in England, where basically there was a construction boom after the interest rates were lowered, and you basically had the brick makers. They were like shipping off pallets of bricks as soon as they were dry, and everyone was fighting for them. Now, why this is a problem is basically nobody finishes the factory, right? Like they're not done. So you have 100 half-built factories, which helps nobody, which doesn't produce capital, which doesn't help society. You have labor that's on the sideline. The system has lost efficiency.
Right. And is that because over time that a system becomes efficient by the aggregation of all the decisions, the inputs
Yes.
and outputs?
Yes.
And any kind of harsh, well, not even harsh, but changing the interest
change
rate
it.
is jolting the
Exactly.
system. It's like an electric shock to it.
Well, it's saying reality is not it. Like, it's not real. It's saying that, so that natural rate emerges among many things from the availability of those resources. And so when you lower it, you're sending signals to the market that resources are abundant when in fact they're scarce. You're distorting what reality is.
So in the free market, that would set, and you could have low interest rates in a free market.
You could, absolutely.
But that would set, because essentially, I mean, interest rate is the rent price for money.
Yeah.
So what would drive low interest rates in a free market?
So it is the availability. It's the availability of capital. It's the availability of entrepreneurship. So how would you get to low interest rates in a free market? You would get to low interest rates in a very abundant world. So in a world, let's say we have all these technology breakthroughs and we can produce stuff super cheaply, and let's say our current world, all else equal, if energy became half the price, like everything's the same, energy's half the price, the natural interest rate would come down. We're more abundant. We have more access to resources. So in an economy where resources and entrepreneurs and business owners, they're everywhere and they're efficient and they're good, you have a lower interest rate, right? It's the signal of a healthy, of like a prosperous system, which is why governments throughout time, they've looked at economies that were prosperous and said, look, their interest rate is low. Maybe if we had a low interest rate, we would also be prosperous. But it's an inversion of that logic.
So when you see this and then you see negative interest rates, what are you thinking then?
Yeah, so that's like saying, I'm going to pay you to borrow my new Mercedes. So I've got a brand new Mercedes and I'm going to pay you to drive it around. Like barring some insane edge case where it costs me $3,000 to park the car, or like I'm not a reliable driver and I'm going to crash it. There's no reason in the real world that would ever happen. Like
because it destroys the value, and I'm paying you to reduce its value.
And it makes no sense.
Yeah.
You would never do it, right? Like you're not gonna buy a brand new house and then pay me to live in it, unless like you need someone to watch it. But it's a distortion of the way actual real human beings make economic decisions. And so there's a thing here, Peter, and it is that money. Why does money command interest, right? Why should money have interest? It's very clear why a factory, like if I were going to rent my factory to you for a year, well, I would need to charge interest for that factory. Why? Because that factory could produce economic activity, and I'm not going to be able to get that if I give it to you. Money inherits that quality from real capital, right? The reason that money has interest is because if I didn't lend that money out, I could use it to purchase or rent real capital, like a factory, and make a return.
Opportunity cost.
Exactly.
And risk.
Exactly.
So how has the financialization of the system sent everything kind of skewy?
Yeah.
And what parts of financialization of the system are acceptable? Like, where have things gone wrong?
So I think where things have gone wrong, one thing I really don't like is there's this thing called a zombie company that emerges from like a low interest rate environment. And what a zombie company is a company that needs to keep borrowing debt to stay alive. If they weren't able to access debt, and usually cheap debt, they would not be able to continue normal business operations. In essence, they're not profitable, right? Like there's a negative energy return. Like more energy goes in than comes out. They're wasting resources, they're wasting capital. But because they can borrow cheaply, they're able to stay in business. And there's a lot of these right now. There's a lot of these companies, and they're really bad for a number of reasons. And they're subsidized by low interest rates. One reason they're bad is so usually these companies are fairly big, and they might make a product or a service that you actually use. So you think, oh, well, I use this thing, it's valuable. But they're doing so in such a way that they're wasting resources. They're inefficient. It's a broken business model. And so in a natural system, there's this creative destruction of capitalism. That company would go bankrupt. And so what happens is you've got this startup over here. You've got this hungry young company with a new business model that comes in. They can buy their capital, their factories, their things. They can hire their skilled employees that were working for the dysfunctional company to come work for the new startup and get that knowledge and talent. And they can also get the customers that were attending to that business, the new startup can get it. And so if the startup has a functional new business model, that comes in, it replaces the dysfunctional zombie company, and the world benefits from that. We have a functional business in place of a dysfunctional business. But if you keep subsidizing the zombie company with cheap debt, that doesn't happen. They just atrophy in the middle of the market. They just sit there burning debt, borrowing people's money, never fixing the problem. And that slows growth, that slows capital formation, and it causes a problem for everybody.
Can you think of any specific examples of companies like that?
So it's any company. So I would normally say, I would mention Uber. I do think they actually had a profitable quarter for the first time recently. So that maybe they've turned it around. You always could turn it around. But there's a ton of these. This debt-based model, right, has become incredibly popular because interest rates have been low. You can borrow for almost nothing, or you have been able to. As rates rise, you're going to see, unless they can find some alternate form of financing or the Fed pivots soon, like they're going to see the real ramifications of that interest expense.
Because all those venture capital funds have been able to raise money so cheaply. There's been such an abundance of money. They've been able to raise money. They can invest in these companies that for years have not made a profit. Some of them go to IPO without ever having made a profit. So is that a massive distortion of the market?
That could happen naturally, right? Like you could just say, Amazon didn't make a profit for a while, and they're a very functional business. Like the story that these investors tell themselves is like, well, we're just investing in growth, right? Like this company is gonna be, prosperous one day, and that could happen, right? That could happen, but a lot of times it doesn't. And so you run into this situation where it basically comes back to, are these companies being subsidized with distorted, manipulated money? And if so, chances are, at least across the system, maybe not any one individual company, you are subsidizing these companies that would not exist otherwise.
So how does Bitcoin fix this?
Yeah. So Bitcoin fixes this because all of these examples, right? We didn't talk about money printing so much, but you can obviously distort prices by printing more money. You can distort prices by artificially lowering interest rates. It's interventions in the natural market, in the information of the system, the spontaneous order. And so when a central authority comes in and they intervene, they distort it. That's just the bottom line. These are all just examples of monetary interventions. And this sounds so simple, right? This sounds so straightforward, but you just don't mess with the money. Money is a measuring tool. It is a communication tool. It holds information. It simplifies things. It helps people make decisions. And when you distort that, you distort the efficiency of the system. So it sounds so simple, but just don't mess with the money. Don't distort the actual money itself. You can have financial products built on top of it. You can do loans. You can have banks. You can have credit. You can have all these things. But if you just don't distort the actual monetary medium and the actual price of money, the time value of money, you don't get a lot of these negative effects. And so why Bitcoin? Because Bitcoin is the first credibly non-interventionary money. The whole innovation of Bitcoin is that it is not able on a monetary level to be distorted or altered. You can't change the supply. And you could have a government that sets interest rates around Bitcoin as a base money.
But good luck enforcing it.
And you're left with the consequences because you can't print more Bitcoin if you make a bad loan. Yeah. You have to actually eat that bad loan, which disincentivizes you from doing it.
Yeah, which is another thing is this these bailouts that we've had, especially during COVID. There were a number of companies that probably should have been allowed to fail and be reset. That hasn't happened. Yeah. We want the constant boom without any bust. We want expansion of the economy and expansion of GDP without contraction. The only way you can get without contraction is by manipulating the money.
And that's another part of it, right? It's this: how do they justify the zombie companies? How do they justify a lot of this stuff?
National security.
and through this kind of the way we think of GDP, what is GDP really? It's revenue. Right? It's how much revenue did you make?
It's not productivity.
It's not It's not profit. It doesn't mean it works. You own a business. You operate a business. Revenue. Okay, that's great. Maybe that shows how much. But if you spent more than that revenue, you didn't make anything. It wasn't profitable. And so they look at it, and so they have this notion. I've talked about this, that if we finance, and so one of these other things is there's this thing that we're just going to kind of spray and pray. We're just going to give out a ton of loans. We're going to fund everything, and we're going to hope that it all works. And they justify it through this way of accounting for GDP, of focusing on revenue, where, okay, if I give WeWork $10 billion, well, they're paying people salaries and people using those salaries to buy stuff, and they're paying taxes. And so it circulates through the economy. But what they don't recognize is that if we fund a bunch of nonsense companies to hire all of our smartest people, the money might be fungible, but those people's time and intellectual output are non-fungible. And so if all those people are working for joke companies, they're not working on fertilizer and rockets and travel. And that is a destruction of capital, right? Where we're wasting capital building nothing, building unimportant things, instead of having those people work on meaningful things. So there's this real impact.
And in this Bitcoin world of uncorruptible money that cannot be printed and probably doesn't have interest rates set, what are the things that people would have to get used to? Those people who've been conditioned to live in this fiat world, what are the changes they're going to have to get used to?
Yeah. So it's most likely going to be more expensive to borrow money. Right? You can look at the interest rate, right? When we were on a gold standard in Europe, the average interest rate was around 6 or 7%.
Yeah.
So that was significantly higher.
Save.
Exactly. Makes it worth it to save. Yeah. And, so interest rates probably higher. And financial activities are going to carry, in a sense, more risk, or at least you're going to be responsible for your own risk, right? There's this, we kind of talked about it, there's this huge subsidization, there's this huge bailout culture, there's this huge kind of trying to remove the impact or responsibility of bad financial decisions from corporations and institutions. And in a Bitcoin, and that's possible because you can print the currency.
Yeah.
Because you can financially engineer the system to paper over those liabilities or there's those bad loans. And in a Bitcoin world, like, you can't do it. No one's got free money, so no one's going to bail everyone out for no reason because it costs them something to do it.
So don't fuck with the money.
Don't fuck with the money. Just leave it alone. Like, let the system organize around it, and there'll be plenty of stuff to do there. And just leave it's like I said, I keep making this comparison, but it's like distorting the value of a number in math or in code. It's just like changing the basic measuring unit. It just messes everything up.